Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest collaborative album between Freddie Gibbs and Madlib, Bandana. This is a follow-up to this duo's 2014 studio album Piñata, which is often regarded as one of the best hip-hop albums of this decade, and personally I think it's a pretty great project as well. I was pretty excited to see what this new upcoming album from these two was going to have in store for us, given that, like a lot of people, I liked that last album that they did together, and some of the singles from this thing were pretty solid as well. Overall, I think Bandana is another solid project from these two. I don't think it's quite as good as Piñata for a variety of reasons I'll get into later on, but I still think it's a really solid album. If you're a fan of what Piñata had to offer, you'll be pretty happy with what you get here on Bandana as well, considering a lot of the positive points on that album also happen to pop up here on this project as well. One of those being Freddie Gibbs and his flows and charisma pretty much. Throughout this thing he has a lot of great flows, pretty varied when it comes to his flows as well. He just has a lot of energy that he brings to the table too, and a lot of personality as well. Lyrically, a lot of the stuff that he talks about isn't super new for him to be covering too, primarily talking about dealing drugs and the negatives and positives that come from this. Stuff that he has, covered in the past to some extent. However, on a lot of the cuts here, he does bring it into somewhat new territory to keep things interesting. Throughout some of the lyrics here on this project, Freddie Gibbs attempts to connect, dealing drugs and what results from this with his own personal life, how it affects his relationships with other people primarily, whether it be his family or, with lovers, things of that sort. He does also attempt to connect it to social and political issues as well at times on this project, which for the most part works out pretty solidly. There are some moments on this thing where some of the more socially aware lyrics I don't think work out quite as nicely. Probably the biggest example being the anti-vax line that pops up on Palmolive, which is just not really all that responsible and kind of ridiculous. Fortunately, the rest of the track has a lot of good things going for it as well, as I'll get to later on. But for the most part though, the lyrics throughout this thing are pretty solid. When it comes to Madlib's production here on this project, it's pretty solid overall. He doesn't really bring all too much new to the table when it comes to, changing his sound up, but for the most part, he's sticking to his traditional sound, but he's executing it really nicely. You have those typical soulful samples that he incorporates into his beats that sound fantastic, and yeah, overall, Freddie Gibbs sounds great over them, so I really don't have all too many complaints for them. The only beat on this thing that is kind of out there by Madlib standards is the beat for the first half of the song, Half Man, Half Cocaine, which is this really trap-inspired instrumental, which is not something I expected to hear from Madlib. Overall, the instrumental isn't bad. I would say it's pretty decent at the end of the day, but it's kind of underwhelming compared to a lot of the other instrumentals on this thing. I mean, I will say that Freddie Gibbs sounds great over this instrumental. He sounds really vicious and nasty. It works really nicely, but just the instrumental by itself, it's kind of odd and out of place on the record, especially considering it's the only moment on this record that really feels super trap-inspired. I can kind of appreciate the experimentation here, but I don't really think it stuck the landing. Also, apparently all of the production here on the album from Madlib was done on his iPad, which is pretty cool considering how great a lot of the production on this thing sounds. Once again, it's not really something that you could really tell just by listening to this project, but another little experiment in this project when it comes to the production I feel like is worth pointing out. This album has a lot of great features on it as well. For example, the track Palmolive that has Pusha T and Killer Mike on it. Both of these features add a lot to this track in my opinion. Pusha T's feature is probably one of my favorites on the entire album. I love the vibe he brings to this feature, and I love how nicely it meshes with Madlib's production. It really makes me want to see a full project from these two together. Killer Mike's feature is a little bit more disappointing in my opinion. That's mostly because he's just kept to the hook here on this track instead of getting a full verse, which given how great a rapper Killer Mike is pretty disappointing overall. Though I will say that the hook he does bring to this track isn't bad in its own right. I like the vibe it has going for it. I think his flow on this hook is pretty great too. I just wish that there was a full verse from him is all. The track Giannis featuring Anderson .Paak is another highlight here in the track listing, and a big reason of that is due to his feature. I really love his soulful vocals here during the hook, and his verse is really great as well. The track Education that comes later on in the track list is another one of the highlights due to its features. This track featuring Yasin Bey, better known as Mos Def, and Black Thought, both of which have some pretty great verses here on this thing. And yeah, overall, like I said, Education is one of the better cuts on this album as a result of this. Overall, this album has a pretty star-studded feature list that overall doesn't really disappoint for the most part. The overall flow of this album is one of the aspects of this project that I'm just not all that big on, to be honest. For one thing, I think the opening to the album is easily the weakest part of this project. The album starts off with a skit that on its own isn't really all that bad or anything, but the next two tracks that follow just feel like some of the weakest in the track listing. The second track is this pretty short cut that overall just feels pretty forgettable. Freddie Gibbs does a pretty nice job with the delivery here on this thing, but lyrically it's not one of the album's more interesting cuts. And the beat to this track is fine for what it is, but once again, I just feel like it's one of the weaker beats that Madlib produced for this project. The third track on the album, Half Man, Half Cocaine, is another song that I think is kind of iffy when it comes to the quality of it. Like I said before, the trap instrumental that starts off this song is one that I'm not exactly the biggest fan of, even though I do think Freddie Gibbs' performance over it isn't all that bad. I do think that when it shifts into the second half of the track, however, it does get a bit better overall. I still think Freddie Gibbs' flow in the second half is pretty great, and the beat overall is pretty solid as well. Not a bad track by any means, but once again, I think when it comes to the quality of the song overall compared to a lot of the other songs in the track list, it is one of the weaker cuts. The album also ends on a bit of a weaker note with the track Soul Right, which once again isn't a bad track on its own or anything, but I just feel like it's one of the more forgettable cuts on this thing when it comes to, the flow, the lyrics, the production here on it. An okay song on its own, but nothing all that special. Overall, I think that Bandana is a pretty solid project at the end of the day, and a pretty solid follow-up to Piñata as well. A lot of what Freddie Gibbs and Madlib do great are on full display here on this project, whether it be Freddie Gibbs' great flows, a lot of his great charisma, some interesting lyricism too, or Madlib's really interesting production here on this thing. There's a lot to enjoy here throughout Bandana's runtime. I do feel, like I said before, that there are some moments on this thing that I'm just not the biggest fan of, whether it be some moments that are just a bit more forgettable overall, or the kind of awkward track placement, especially when it comes to the start and the end of the project, but still, these problems really shouldn't get in your way of enjoying this album. If you're a fan of hip-hop, if you're a fan of Freddie Gibbs or Madlib or Piñata, you should definitely give this album a listen if you haven't done so already, because it will not disappoint. But that is just my own personal opinion when it comes to this album. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. So if you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.